Okay, good morning. I have collected for you some facts and figures about our invited speaker, about Manfred Sailer. He was born sometime in the previous century in a country that was then called the Bundesrepublik Deutschland. He well survived the Cold War and obtained subsequently his master's degree in 1995 and his PhD in 2003, both at the University of Tübingen. From 2004 till 2012, he was a senior lecturer at the English department of the University of Göttingen, and in that period he also got his habilitation degree. Since 2012, Manfred is professor of English linguistics at the University of Frankfurt. Going through his long list of publications, there are a few themes that stand out. One is idioms, collocations, and multi-word expressions. I think he's not going to talk about that. Another one is negation and negative polarity, including work on German, English, French, Welsh, and indeed Polish as well. But I think you're not going to talk about that either. And then the third one is a series of works on formal semantics and its interaction with syntax, and I think that's what you're going to hear today about. So Manfred will be talking about the concept of definiteness, both from a semantic and a syntactic point of view. So before giving him the floor, I have two warnings to make. The syntax is HBSG, and the second warning is of a more personal kind. Manfred told me yesterday that he is something of a compulsive consumer of food. So in spite of what his lean figure suggests, he is constantly thinking of food. So if he interrupts the talk for having a snack or two, don't worry, it's normal behavior. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, hello, yeah, so as you can see from the title, I'm not going to talk about any of my ordinary subjects, and but about largely on joint work with Asif Amdavid, and Asif has done his PhD on a topological study of definiteness marking, and we've now tried to integrate that into HBSG and give it sort of some, integrate with the work that I've been doing on the syntax semantics interface. Now, last time I gave a talk in Poland, I actually talked on Polish and embarrassed myself a bit, but at least I was able to read my example sentences, but that was about it. So I'm not going to do the same thing now, but I nonetheless decided to have sort of some local flavor to my talk, and so I decided to have examples from 3 languages, and 2 of those languages are of course directly related to Poland and to Warsaw, namely Yiddish and Esperanto. And Esperanto, so the inventor of Esperanto actually lived in Warsaw when he published his first book. And then the third language is Papiamento, which is a Creole language spoken in Curaçao, Bonaire, and Aruba, so next to Venezuela. Now I was very happy actually that Esperanto is still alive in Warsaw, and so if you've seen those things, the veturillo, that is of course Esperanto. It means drive tool, so it just means vehicle, the Esperanto word for vehicle, and so there is a lot of Esperanto everywhere here in Warsaw. All these bikes are veturilloi. Good. So now let's look at definiteness marking, and here I've taken the first couplet of a famous Yiddish song, and I've marked the definiteness marking, the definite noun phrases or definite noun phrase-like things. And so you see Eufen Pripetschik, which is translated on the hearth, so with the definite article in English, and in Yiddish you have the Eufen, which is one, it's spelled as one word, you have sort of a contracted form. In the second line, Unin Stub is heiß, so there is actually no form visible of an article at all, whereas in English we do find in the house. And then in the next 2 lines it looks basically like English, der Rebbe, and then dem Aleph Beis, right. So what I'm going to talk about is the various uses of various forms of definite articles in the three languages that I've mentioned before. Okay, so I'll look at definiteness marking in three environments in these languages, namely proper nouns, unique nouns, things like sun and moon, and with anaphoric definites. I will look at some things that we didn't feel comfortable about with existing proposals, and then the basic idea is based on, as I said, on joint work and recent work by Asif Amdavid, and he's just now finished a manuscript on where he looked at a huge variety of languages that have more than one definite article. And then I'll look at a semantic analysis of the three contexts, so proper nouns, unique nouns, and anaphoric definites, and I'll combine that with a syntactic analysis for the three languages at hand, and then I'll have a short conclusion. Okay. So I will always start with Esperanto because that's the easiest language of the three, then go to Papiamento, and then go to Yiddish, which is has the most complicated system. So basically, like all my Esperanto examples, I could just as well have given you English examples. So the Esperanto article system, the definite article, is very similar to the English one. So skimming works.
I'll just checking words.
Perfect. Okay, Esperanto, just as English, has just one definite article, which is la. There is a contracted form, like del, pril, but it's only used in poetry. I'm not going to look at that. There's no indefinite article, but we're not going to look at the indefinite anyways. The main resources that I'm going to use are two reference grammars, and there is a wonderful corpus of Esperanto text and additional web pages on Esperanto. For Papiamento, we have again one definite article, which is e or el. There is a contracted form with the preposition of, which is je, but I didn't find any systematic literature on that, so I'm going to ignore that as well. There's an indefinite article un, which we are going to ignore. The main sources I'm going to use are, again, like a textbook and a reference grammar, which are both von Putte and von Putte de Wind. And there is actually, this is, among the three languages, this is the one where the phenomenon of definiteness marking has actually been actively discussed in the literature, so I can also rely on linguistic publications there. And at the moment there is no corpus of Papiamento, so I'm just using web pages in Papiamento mainly. Okay. For Yiddish, it's what makes it hopefully a bit easier, or maybe it's the danger, but a bit easier for me, so that the Yiddish system is very similar to the standard German system as presented in Schwarz's thesis. So we have definite articles, der, die, das, with like feminine and several case markings and so on, and plural. The interesting thing is that we have like full forms like in der Stub, but we also have contracted forms with prepositions, as we saw in this song, so Affen Pripetschik, and you also have sort of prepositions that are followed by bare nouns like in Stub. And for the time being, I'm going to treat these two, the Affen Pripetschik and the in Stub cases, as sort of similar. There is an indefinite article, which I'm not going to look at. The main sources I'm using are reference grammars again, and there is a wonderful corpus of modern Yiddish that is online available, and it's a great resource. Okay, so three environments that I'm going to look at are proper names, uniques, and anaphoric definites. Let's start with the proper names. In the three languages, proper names are usually not accompanied by a definite article. So in the first, I only look at the primary uses of proper names. So these are cases where the proper name refers to an individual that bears a certain name. And so we have, in the first example, we have al Varsovia, so to Warsaw, which is used without article. The same in Papiamento, Korsau, which is also used without article, and in Yiddish also Chaim.Bald, so there's again the name is used without an article. We do, however, sometimes find articles with proper names, namely when there is a further modification going on in the proper name. So we shouldn't completely ban syntactically the combination of the proper name and the article. So you have der Reuter heim kommt bald. Okay, let's look at the unique nominals. So they're unique nominal if there is exactly one referent in any utterance situation, and that reference is then an individual, and examples are things like son, pope, US president, weather, and so on. And see with the pope, of course we know that in history we had popes and counter-popes and everything, so we sometimes had two popes at the same time, but normally we assume there's just one pope. Now in Esperanto, uniques are used with an article, so you have la suno subite sin montris el la nuboi. In Papiamento, you cannot use a definite article with a unique. So it's solo tabrilla sin misericordia and not e solo tabrilla. In Yiddish, you use a definite article. So der Melech hat gehört die Sach. But if it's possible, you use the contracted form. So which you can only use after prepositions. So it's you've gekommen zum Melech. So there the zum is the contracted form. Okay, so for the uniques, it's now what is unique depends upon the context. So we can sort of zoom in to smaller situations to have uniques, and also what is a unique in one language need not necessarily be a unique in another language. So if cases where things like mother is treated like it has the interpretation of like my mother or a prominent person's mother, and then it's treated as a unique in some language but not in other languages. And there's the trend that languages seem to use sort of less marking for uniques than they use for other definites. Okay, finally let's look at the anaphoric definites. So an anaphoric definite refers to a previously introduced referent or a referent that is available locally available in the space. And here's the Esperanto example. Mi havas grandan domon, la domo havas du etaĝojn. And there you see granda domo is the antecedent and la domo, so we use a definite article and it's impossible to leave out the definite article. The same for Papiamento. We saw there that we don't use the definite article with the uniques, but we do use it in anaphoric definites. So mia cumpra un bollo, e bollo avordu come den 10 minut. So there you see you must use the definite article in this anaphoric definite context. In Yiddish, also the definite article is used in these contexts, and in 11 you see it in the subject position, und der Mann. So there would not be an alternative with a contracted form, but if you look in 12 you have von dem Mann, so there would be an alternative with a contracted form von dem Mann, but this is not used in the anaphoric context. So in the anaphoric context we must use the full form of in these anaphoric definites, we must use the full form of the definite article. Okay, that's the data summary. So Esperanto, you see, it uses the definite article except for proper names. In Papiamento, we only use it for the anaphoric definites. In Yiddish, we have for the unique nominals. If the option is sort of morphologically available, the contracted form is used. Otherwise, of course, you would also use the full form. Okay, now let's look at previous approaches, and that's going to be a bit short. There is a lot of research on that, but we had sort of like basic disagreement with that, and for that reason, this section is going to be rather short. I'll first present the basic ingredients of the prominent analyses that are also going to be basic ingredients of our own analysis, and then just mention the cases or the aspect that we find not so attractive in what we found in the literature. But of course, we may just have missed part of the literature because it's sort of definiteness, it's sort of libraries are written on that. Okay, so one basic ingredient in the semantics of definites is the Yata Operators. So most people love and use the Yata operator as if they want to express definiteness, and so Yata x phi, and there is so this has two components. So first it has a presuppositional component, that this expression is only defined if there is exactly one individual A, such that that individual has that property phi. And when it is defined, then actually this expression denotes this individual A. Since we have to sort of work with uniques and with anaphoric definites, we will use situations, and like from my personal background, to apologize in an LFD, HBSD context, I'm sort of more thinking in the, sort of the Kratzer style situations, which are sort of taken as partial worlds, but I don't think too much it depends on that. Then we are going to play around with presuppositions and conventional implicatures. And so presuppositions need to be satisfied for a formula in order to be interpretable. But they can be sort of accommodated locally. And we are going to play around with these properties of presuppositions. And for conventional implicatures, it's that, so they have a truth value independent of the rest of the sentence. With the presupposition, there's this interdependence. Like if you don't satisfy the presupposition, you cannot interpret the formula. Whereas with a conventional implicature, you basically have two formulae that you can interpret independently of each other. But these conventional implicatures, they cannot be locally accommodated as presuppositions could. Now, the basic problem that we have with most of the approaches is that if you look at the commonly assumed semantics of the Yata operator, it uses two meaning components of definiteness as a presupposition. So uniqueness and existence are part of the presuppositions. So you have the definiteness conditions here, and so there is exactly one individual. So you have the existence and the uniqueness, which are both part of the definiteness conditions. They are both part of the presupposition. And there is already existing a lot of literature, or some literature, that shows that this is not how things work. So that we actually need to take apart the existence and the uniqueness. And so some examples are like in 14, because you can cancel existence, like in, he's not the ambassador to Spain, because Spain doesn't have an ambassador here. So that's sort of okay, so you would cancel the existence, but you cannot cancel the uniqueness. So he's not the ambassador to Spain, there are two. No way. There's a clear contrast between 14 and 15. Also, there are two ambassadors to Spain, therefore he's not the ambassador to Spain. Right? So violating the existence is not as bad as violating uniqueness. So you shouldn't put them together on the same level, and that's exactly sort of the main objection that we have to the standard treatments of definiteness. And so everyone who actually every approach where these things are put together has already sort of suffers from this basic objection. Okay. Another problem that we have is, or where we differ from other things, is sort of the scope of the analysis. So many analyses focus on the article and its meaning, or they focus on the noun and its meaning. And we think that actually you have to look at both aspects, the noun and the article. Sorry. Because in a way, as we're going to see later, with proper nouns and uniques, they are both definite, but they differ with respect to whether they want to have an article or not. It's also the case if, like we find in Standard German, similar to what we find in Yiddish, that we have in certain syntactic combinations, namely in preposition phrases, we find contrasts in the article system that are absent from other syntactic constellations. And very often then, people tend to focus on these interesting things, named the preposition phrases, and then somehow the global picture is lost. So the idea that like for example in the Yiddish case, we have to account for the fact that we do have the contracted form, which is restricted to the unique context, but still the full form of the definite article can also occur in those unique contexts if there is no syntactic possibility to do the contraction. Okay. And then, of course, many approaches that work like in more universalist frameworks, they try to have a uniform structure of noun phrases, determinative phrases, and then they assume a lot of empty elements and also empty determiners, and we're trying to do without empty determiners if possible, or unless we see there's strong evidence for them. Okay, now, so let's look at what we think is the definite meaning, or what we assume as the definite meaning. And so as I said, this is based on like a recent manuscript by Asif and on some joint conference presentations, and some of you have heard an earlier version of that in Paris in 2014 at the second European HBSD workshop. And yeah, okay, but the basic ideas were presented elsewhere as well. So we assume, as you may suggest already, or may guess from the way I presented or discussed the Yata operator, we'll actually work with 3 dimensions of meaning, namely the asserted content, a presupposition, and a conventional implicature. So the asserted content of a definite description will be an individual, the presupposition will be that of existence, and the conventional implicature will then encode the uniqueness. And when we apply that system to our 3 semantic contexts, then it's clear that like proper names are very similar to uniques, but they have an additional naming presupposition. The uniques will be treated in such a way that they require uniqueness in sort of all typical situations. And the anaphoric definites will also require uniqueness, but not in those typical situations, but in the current situation. And there is this anaphoric component to it, which is sort of a standard in the analysis of anaphoric definites. So it all uses ingredients from the semantic analyses in the literature. It's just that because we are explicitly using these 3 dimensions, they are distributed somewhat differently from what we find in other papers. Okay. So in this wonderful manuscript, Asif has looked at languages with several definite articles. And so the most we can find is in Frisian, at least in some version of it, we have 3 definite articles, whereas like Ebert and other, or Schwarz, they all only talk about 2 definite articles, but in fact, in some dialects, or in some regions, we actually have 3 definite articles. And Asif looks at a large group of languages from from all groups of languages and so on, where we have more than 1 definite article. He also looks at a wide range of contexts. Here I restrict myself to 3 contexts, but of course there are many more contexts, such as like weak definites and all sorts of like generics and bridging contexts and so on. And I'm leaving these aside, but they are all included there also in that paper. Now, then sort of what we've tried to express in our joint work is that we look at three inferences that capture the various differences between definite contexts. And the one that is sort of almost always available is a maximality inference, namely that there's exactly one maximal individual that satisfies the descriptive content of the noun in the current situation. And we use the maximal individual to treat plurals and masses, but I'm going to ignore that here as well. The second inference is the one that we use for the unique context, and it's a common ground uniqueness, so that in every situation in the common ground we have the case that if there is an object that satisfies the descriptive content of the noun in that situation, then there's exactly one such object in the situation. So that's uniqueness with respect to the common ground. And then anaphoricity, which is the inference that we need for the anaphoric definiteness. Anaphoric definiteness is that there's exactly one object that satisfies the descriptive content of the noun in the current situation, and this object is part of the current universe of discourse, so it's somewhat available in the discourse already. And then Asif has come up with this semantic map of the various contexts, and so we have those contexts where we satisfy here, that's B. So that is the uniques. Then we've got the anaphorics, and in between we have a situation where we just have maximality, but neither of the other two. And actually, in this, I don't know how many languages there was, like 20 languages that he discusses in his paper. You actually see that the uses of the definite articles in the various languages, they group nicely, or they can be grouped nicely in this semantic map. Here, of course, I'm using uniques and anaphoric definites, so I'm not looking at the middle area here. Okay, when we look at our articles as we've seen them so far, we see that the Esperanto article la is used in both B and C context. The Papiamento article e is only used in the C context, in this anaphoric definite context. With Yiddish der, so the full form of the article is always used it's the one that you must use in the anaphoric definite. And if you don't have another option because of some morphosyntactic quirks, you use the full form. Otherwise, you would use the contracted form in the unique cases. Okay, now an important ingredient of our approach is, as I said, that we want to claim that the uniqueness inference is not a presupposition, but that it is a conventional implicature. And that is actually, we're going to elaborate on that claim in a paper that I hope to get some more progress during this week. And so we basically use two main criteria that are a sort of accepted differences between presuppositions and conventional implicatures, namely that the independence or the dependence of the truth values of an utterance and its inference, and then whether it's possible to have a non-global accommodation. If we look at the truth values, so the truth value of an utterance can vary independently of that of a conventional implicature, whereas for the presuppositions, the truth value of the utterance is only defined if the presupposition is true. So I gave you, again, an Esperanto example where an English example would have done just as fine. She cesis fumi, sed ŝi ankoraŭ drinkas. So she stopped smoking, but she's still drinking alcohol. So the presupposition is she smoked before and she drank before. And so that comes from the verb cesi and from the from ankoraŭ, from still. And then you have a conventional implicature, which is triggered by sed, so but, that not smoking and drinking are somehow funny together. So there's a contrast between them. Now, and you can see easily that the truth of the sentence, so whether she stopped smoking and still drinks, whether that is true or false, is independently of whether you assume, can be true independently of whether you assume that not drinking but still smoking are in contrast to each other. Right? So it's clear that for the presupposition, it interacts with the truth value of the utterance, whereas the conventional implicature doesn't. And what gets us a bit closer to to the case of the definite is what we find with formal and informal forms of addressing. And there I'm using a German example. Alex hat Sie gestern gesehen, so the capital Z, that's a formal use. So Alex saw you yesterday. And because what is the meaning of Z? It's just the addressee. There's a conventional implicature, however, that there's a formal relation between the speaker and the addressee. So, for example, if I said to Stefan, ich habe Sie gestern gesehen, So then the truth, this would be true if you look at the denotation, because I have met him, we've actually met yesterday, seen each other yesterday, but I would violate the conventional implicature because we are not in the right social relation to each other that is would be appropriate, right? So you see that there is, so these are just independent of each other, the truth value of the sentence and the truth value of the conventional implicature. The second test is, when you apply that to definites, we can see exactly that. So here's the sentence, Hanno accetis la libron, so Hanno bought the book. So the denotation, as we are going to assume it, is that Hanno bought something that is a book. It's basically like Hanno bought a book. But there's a conventional implicature that there is a unique book in the situation. And of course, if there are two books under the assumed denotation that Hanno accetis la libron, so Hanno bought the book, just means Hanno bought something that is a book. And if Hanno buys actually one of the two books, then the sentence would be true. But the conventional implicature that there is just one unique book, that would be false. Okay, so you see, if you make the assumption about the denotation of the definite article that we are going to make, then the uniqueness comes out as a conventional implicature and behaves like one. Okay, now the second test is the local accommodation, and there we claim that conventional implicatures must hold at the overall utterance level, whereas presuppositions can be accommodated at certain points, like under negation, in conditionals, in interrogatives, and other cases. And so again, you have this contrast with the stopping to smoke. So she necessis fumi, she neniam fumis. So she didn't stop smoking, she never smoked. So the presupposition that she smoked before can be accommodated in the scope of negation. If, however, I have something like the formal Sie thing, like Sie haben nicht mit dem Rauchen aufgehört, where this conventional implicature is that there is a formal relation between the speaker and the addressee, then this formal relation doesn't disappear just by using a negation, right? Right, now with all these tools at hand, we can now look at the definite meaning. And we start with the proper names. And I'm using this S with subscript 0 for the current situation, which you just find your theory of how language interacts with the rest of the world will give you the current situation. Okay, let's use the name Franjo, which is the Esperanto short form for something like Franziska. And so the ascertained content of the name Franjo would be an individual. So the name refers directly to an individual. And then in the case of the proper names, we've got two presuppositions. Namely, one, it's the existence presupposition that there is actually a person that is called Franjo in the current situation. And then we have this special system, the special presupposition that comes with the proper names, namely that the referent is called Franjo in the current situation. And then we have a conventional implicature, that's the uniqueness implicature, that in the common ground, in all the typical situations that are relevant at the moment, if there is somebody called Franjo, then there's exactly one such person called Franjo. Okay. So it doesn't mean if there is one Franjo, there can only be one Franjo, but it's like, I've chosen the paraphrase carefully. So if there is a person called Franjo, then there is just one, because you could have maybe two people with the name Franjo, but only one is actually called Franjo in that situation. Okay, I told you that I had my problems with the Yata operator, so I cannot really use any Yata operator, so I use an Yata operator with a subscript exists to indicate that this Yata operator only shares the existence presupposition, but not the uniqueness presupposition. So basically, we have these expressions, so Yata exists X, phi, and the denotation is just some A that has the property, and that's sort of is one that has the property described in phi. So there's something missing in the formula here, sorry. So it's basically like you pick out any A, it's like a free choice something. But this notation makes it closer to what we are used to see in definiteness. Now I use that in for the semantics of the uniques. So if we have suno, the sun, so the asserted content is just some individual that is a sun. The presupposition is that there actually exists a sun in the current situation, and the conventional implicature is that in the typical situations, if there is a sun, and that should be an X, sorry for that, then there's exactly one sun. For the anaphoric definites, things are sort of, I think they look a bit sort of less nice, but that's the way they are. The anaphoric definiteness, they have this anaphoric component. So the referent of the anaphoric definite must be identical to something else. So there's an identity condition, and that something else must be something that is accessible in the discourse. So there's this discourse accessibility condition. And these will be then included into the uniqueness condition for the anaphoric definites. So if you have la studento, the students used as an anaphoric definite, the asserted content is someone who is a student in the current situation. The presupposition is that there is a student in the current situation, and the conventional implicature is if there is a student in the current situation, then there is exactly one student in the current situation. That student is identical to somebody else, or is identical to someone who is actually accessible in the discourse. So you have the usual uniqueness presupposition, and you see it's the same as I've used it before. I've even wrongly used the same constants. And in addition, you have these anaphoricity conditions, which also look like what people standardly assume. Good. So what do we have to sum up here? We have a three-dimensional representation of the definite meaning. The asserted content is an individual that satisfies the descriptive content if there is such. Like for proper names, there is no descriptive content. That's the property of the names, many people assume. There's an existence presupposition, and there's a uniqueness conventional implicature. But where exactly the uniqueness has to hold depends on the kind of definite context. What is then missing, of course, is a representation of these three dimensions in HBSG and a discussion on how this marking works. So I'll first do the representation and then come to the marking. Now, I assume a semantics of HBSG that is based on techniques of underspecified semantics, but this also doesn't really matter here too much. There have been proposals for multidimensional semantics, so for conventional implicatures in a paper by Bonamy and Godard, for structured meaning to encode information structure in Hasegawa-König. And I think HBSG is a very nice framework for doing things like projective meaning, because what HBSG has sort of a long tradition in is like percolating things and retrieving things. And that's what you do with projective meaning, of course. Good. So, basically, if you have that, don't have to look at all of those. What's important is that we have the external content, so that's basically the logical form of a sentence, or in that case of a noun phrase. And we have a parts list because we live in an underspecified semantics world, so this means we collect bits of logical form and we assume that at some appropriate level, at this utterance or at an embedded clause, all these bits of logical form must be put together to have the logical form associated with the syntactic unit. And I'm going to use these Greek variables to indicate that that is something that's still underspecified. That's something we don't know. It's underspecified. Then I use the Greek variables. Okay. Now, how do we encode presuppositions and conventional implicatures in the system? So I'll basically have list values, attributes, presupposition, and conventional implicature. And I must assume that whatever is on these additional lists must also be on the parts list, because eventually it will all be integrated into the overall logical form. For presuppositions, so those content bits that are on the presupposition list, they can be retrieved in appropriate nodes and be then integrated in under the scope of operators if you have local accommodation. If they aren't integrated, then they percolate up. And for the conventional implicatures, it's the same. It's just there are fewer nodes where you could actually retrieve the conventional implicatures. You can only retrieve them as sort of full utterances or in the scope of like sort of assertion or other sort of speech act operators, basically. Good. And that's an example. So for Franjo, we have the content is basically just the individual, Franjo. And then we've got the two presuppositions, so the existence and the naming presupposition that are also on the parts list, and we have the uniqueness conventional implicature, which is also on the parts list. So you see how these three dimensions are just straightforwardly turned into HBSD features. Good. Now that's the definite meaning. Let's look at the definite marking. Okay, so I told you that we want to look at the noun and the article, and it's their interaction that we want to account for. So we have to look at lexic entries for nouns and articles. And in Yiddish, we have to pay special attention to these preposition noun phrase combinations. For proper names, we've already seen the semantic part on like 2 slides ago. Now, in the syntax, I just assume that the proper name has an empty subject requirement, an empty const requirement, and it optionally combines with a determiner. And it will then be the syntax of the language that will decide on whether we need or we can have the definite determiner or not. So in many languages, once we modify the proper name, we need the determiner. In my variety of Southern German, I use determiners all the way with proper names. Of course, because of this presupposition, which is the uniqueness presupposition of the proper name, I will not be able to use the proper name with an article that is an article used for anaphoric definites only, because then there may be a clash in the conventional implicatures. Okay, now if I look at a unique noun, such as son, so suno or sun, so that is just sun, that's just the Yiddish one, sorry for that. It's just the Yiddish one, sun. There is a definite article required syntactically, but the noun itself, since it's a unique noun, it already comes with all these definiteness semantics. It already refers to one thing that is a son. It has the existence presupposition, and it has the uniqueness presupposition, because it's a unique noun. So this is not the task of the definite article alone to contribute these things. It's a lexical property of the unique noun, as Loebner says also. If we then look at the articles, so what we see for the nouns, they encode their nominal class, whether they are proper nouns, then they encode the uniqueness. If they are unique nouns, then they also encode the uniqueness already in the semantics. Now, what does the article do? The Esperanto article doesn't do very much. It just gets us the Yata exists operator. It has the existential presupposition, and it has basically the weakest uniqueness requirement that we can have for the definite context, namely that in the current situation, if there is such an individual, then it must be a unique individual. In Papiamento, remember, we only use the definite article in the anaphoric definites, so the uniqueness requirement of the definite article in Papiamento must be stronger than what we find in Esperanto. So the asserted content and the presupposition is the same as in Esperanto, but here as the uniqueness requirement, see that now we get the one for the anaphoric context. So here we had just a dummy one, basically required uniqueness in the current situation, and here we actually require uniqueness in the current situation, but an anaphoric relation to something else in the discourse. And this immediately derives that we cannot have use it with so we cannot use it with with a proper name and with a unique noun. Okay. Now, if we look at Yiddish, we have to be careful because we see that, or we know that the definite article is used, the full form of the definite article can be used in all contexts actually. So that is why we need to have a very weak uniqueness requirement on the full form of the definite article. And we only have to do funny things when we look at the context with the prepositions. And there I assume that these contracted forms of the preposition and the definite article, they behave externally like a preposition phrase and internally like an article. So externally they are preposition phrases, but internally they select a nominal expression. So that's what you can see here. So it's a presupposition. It's a preposition. But on its comms list, it has a noun that still requires an article, right? So we have certain requirements on when that contraction is possible. So it's possible with singular masculines and neuter in dative case or in oblique case. And then for these contracted forms, we have on the asserted semantics, on the asserted content, we now have the semantics of the presupposition of the preposition also, of course. But the presupposition is the existential one, and the conventional implicature is the one that we find for the unique context, because we saw that these contracted forms only occur in the unique context. Now, how do we deal with these combinations where the preposition actually combines with a full noun phrase? So, and there, that's actually so it looks on the surface, it looks like the boring case, but it's actually like, when you come to encode it, it's sort of the most complicated case, because there you have to say, okay, now if you have a preposition that combines with a noun, and that noun can in principle have a contracted form, because it's in the right morphological form, it's a singular, masculine, or neuter, and in the right case, but you do not use the contracted form, then you must explicitly ban the appropriate uniqueness conventional implicatures, right? And that's what I do here, right? So you have to exclude that fun dem is used with a unique context, even though dem, of course, so the full form of the definite article can occur in unique contexts, in those cases where there is no contracted form. Okay, good. So, let's then sort of have a short summary for the definite marking. So and we get an interaction, so the syntactic selection accounts for the difference between proper names and unique nominals. So it's the unique nominals require a definite article in some languages, forbid a definite article in some languages. The syntactic selection is the one that determines whether in a particular syntactic context, in a particular language, you would combine a proper noun with a definite article or not. So that is not taken care of in the semantics, but it's taken care of in syntax, in the selection requirements. Now, there is sort of a open question whether what happens in Papiamentu if you use a unique noun in an anaphoric definite context. And I'm chasing for examples of these constellations, but I couldn't find good ones. I only found bridging examples, but I found it in like other languages that have similar systems to Papiamentu. There it seems that in those cases you can actually also sometimes use this definite article with the unique noun if it's clear that you are in an anaphoric definite context. But there the Papiamentu data, I couldn't sort of get enough information on that. Okay. I have proposed a single word analysis for the contracted preposition in Yiddish and an appropriate analysis for the non-contracted forms with a special conventional implicator. Okay, so let's then have a summary and further perspectives. So I have applied this more general and typologically motivated approach to definiteness marking that Asif and in part Asif and myself have been working on, and I've applied that to the case of 3 languages. And of course, if you look at individual languages in detail, then you have to look at the interaction between syntax and semantics. and hope to have shown that this is that you actually need to look at that because of those cases where semantically these things are the same, like with the proper names and the unique nouns, but syntactically you still have a variation whether you get an article or not. I think that a multi-dimensional semantics is very natural in HBSG because we have this. We've done percolation and retrieval for decades now, and we just do that now in the semantics. And the three languages that I've used, I've also chosen those languages not only because of the local flavor with Warsaw and Poland, but also there is little work on them in HBSG so far. There is something by Stefan and Bane, and there is on Yiddish, and there is one paper I found on inflection morphology in Esperanto, and there was an exercise sheet for an LKB course once that used Esperanto as an example language because it's a very simple language. For Papiamento, I couldn't find anything. So if you have pointers for Papiamento publications in HBSG, please let me know. Now, there are some natural extensions of this theory, namely to demonstratives and to pointing gestures. Because you've seen that the anaphoric definites, they require uniqueness within the universe of discourse, but of course I could require the uniqueness with respect to other universes, and that's similar to these the P-sets that Hawkins has been writing about, where you have like this, so the room where all the elements in the discourse are, but also the things where all the individuals in my visual space are, or if there has been work by Looking and colleagues, if I point somewhere, then my finger creates a space, and then I would have a uniqueness requirement with respect to this cone that my pointing gesture identifies. Of course, I have to say something that is at least compatible with Polish, even though I'm not putting any Polish example there. What about article-less languages? This theory, I hope, can be very naturally applied to article-less languages because we put a lot of the semantics also inside the noun. We take like Loebner's noun classes, or we have a reformulation of these noun classes where the nouns themselves already contribute a lot of the definiteness semantics. And of course, even though you do not have an article, depending on the language, definite-like things can be marked in particular constructions or by word order, and then you could just have those syntactic constructions introduce the appropriate conventional implicatures. There are, of course, many, many open issues, so we should definitely look at more contexts also in those three languages, and all these I think 8 or 9 contexts that Asif has looked at in his study. As I said, I'm a bit uncomfortable with these anaphoric definites, and we need to have an explicit link to accessibility theory like RDL, where you say, okay, when is it that you actually use the anaphoric definite and not the pronoun or something else? There's a natural connection to indexicals, since our definite nouns refer to something that is an individual that is unique in a particular set of situations, and that is, and there are approaches that link proper nouns to indexicals like me and you and so on. And of course, there are not just the primary uses of proper names, but also secondary uses of proper names, like something like, I don't know, a real Merkel would never do something like that, and that they would assume some shifting operation, and that also can be naturally included, but then the question is, where does the original conventional implicature of the proper name end up? Right, so, schönen Dank, multan dankom, masha danki.
So, thank you. It's very interesting. What would make me nervous, I think, and perhaps that's a misunderstanding, is this. So, is this the good distance to...
It should be good.
Okay, good, okay. is that so two questions. The account is completely lexical, and that suggests that so not a property of language, but a property of items in a language. And I wonder if that. Shall I repeat it now? Property of items in a language, not property of language. I wonder if there's evidence of language having, for example, two different articles. Yes, no question. The other question is this: that you have, you make the uniqueness of the sun a sort of lexical property.
Yes.
And it isn't, of course, because if you're in a different world, you have different suns. It's not. It's a, so to speak, a real-world property. Now, the converse of that is the proper names. Mm-hmm. They can also become, so all the Manfreds in this room are. That sort of thing. So talk about those two things, if you would.
I'm not sure I got the first one. So the question is like, is it all like, are all these things, do they all come from lexical items, or do I leave room for having them somewhere else? That's basically what I try to suggest with these few words on the article-less languages, right? Of course, in the language that I've looked at, we have these lexical items that carry these meaning contributions at the various dimensions. But of course, you could think of like constructions, including those. It's like what you also have like with conventional implicatures. Like if you have I don't know what some people claim for non-restrictive relative clauses, they somehow turn the descriptive content into a conventional implicature, and that is something that is not related to any lexical item in the, but it comes from the construction. And so since you have to allow for like conventional implicatures being introduced by constructions, I would just, that's all there already, right? And now the second question had.
So why is the sun?
Oh, why is the sun? Exactly. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So, and with all the Manfreds in the room, these are basically those approaches that are are used as sort of the data that are used as counterexamples to these referential theories of proper names, and have sort of promoted these descriptive theories of proper names. And the version that I'm using here is sort of a compromise between the two. So, the existence is a presupposition. The uniqueness is a conventional implicature. What do you get with all the Manfreds in the room? I hope it works out, but it should still be a primary use, because you're referring not to people who are like me, Manfred, or like me, but people who have the name Manfred, right? Exactly. So I hope there are enough things for that to make it work. And at least, so the way it's constructed, it tries to incorporate ideas from this, basically what people are doing nowadays, where they go for compromises between referential and descriptive theories of proper names. But of course I have to look at all the Manfred cases.
So I find the case of the sun much more worrying.
Yeah, okay, with the sun, there it's, the question is, what does the sun mean? So I personally have the impression, it's like with mother. It's like in my version of German, mother is not a unique noun, but I know that in like many people in Austrian German, they use mother in the meaning of my mother, or the mother of a salient person. So there you would have sort of some implicit argument that like whose mother that is. And there's a similar thing for the sun, right? So the sun as a unique is sort of the sun relevant to a particular community, to the speaker, something like that. And I think if you do the normal test for ambiguity, actually things like sun come out as ambiguous. Or with, like, is it this in Tatooine in Star Wars? They have two suns, or do they have two moons, right? I don't know. I think they have two suns, right? And then, of course, for their world, the sun would not be unique, right? There is, of course, another problem which comes with like body part expressions, like with ears and fingers. So we have more than one, but we still treat an arbitrary one of those as if we just had one, right? So I broke the leg, you can just break any of your two legs, right? And that is systematically the case for those body part expressions that come in several instances. And there, I've started thinking about that, but I think that's really a separate case where something special going on in the semantics of the body parts. Yeah. So I don't know who was first.
This is kind of a follow-up question to Doug going on.
Very interesting question. It's profound, it's yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the follow-up question is, I mean, I don't know, the only language I know that has two definite articles is Catalan. Mm-hmm. And in Catalan, then you can get a distinction. So you would get la, which is the same one as your French or Esperanto.
Yeah.
And then sa. And then the difference would be la church, for example, would be the church we're talking about over there, and sa church would be the abstract entity, which is unique, which refers to the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
No other church in that part of the world Catholic. Or la law. Okay, la law would be the law we've been discussing.
Yeah.
Sa law would be
Yeah.
the law in an abstract
Yeah.
sense. That seems to imply that it's something to do not with the specific lexical item,
but the interaction between the article and
predicate.
Yeah.
and how does that work in your system?
Okay. Yeah. That's actually that's sort of an additional not semantic dimension, but sort of analytic dimension that I've sort of deliberately left out here. Has to do with also if you say the church, it also has to do with what does the church refer to? It's either the a building or it's the abstract whatever. And so it's basically the sortal type of the referent of the nominal also plays an important role. And you see also like in English you have, so we assume that kinds are unique as well, so all generic things are somewhat unique, and we see that with generics we find lesser use of article than we find with concrete objects, right? So in the semantics of the articles, it's not only needs to be specified what's their uniqueness, conventional implicatures, but also they may have sortal restrictions with respect to the sortal properties of the nominals that they combine with. And I think actually the Catalan case is actually also discussed in Asif's paper, and there it is a small paragraph, but there that would be a case where we actually see that the sortal properties of the noun are another factor in the lexical description of the article. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your talk. All your examples were about singular nouns with the definite article, but the definite article also combines with plural nouns. So how would your analysis generalize to plurals?
Okay, now so that's why we have this in the this maximality thing. So actually, so the way the existence, the uniqueness incorporates actually a maximality thing, so that there is, if there is an entity, then there is a unique maximal entity, right? Basically, you and that's this. Also, that's what's part of the standard definition of the Yata operator is if you want to use the Yata operator with the plural semantics, then you build into its meaning this maximalization operation, so that you claim that there is a unique maximal thing. And we would just do the same, or I would just do the same thing here. As you said, I've just left it out because I only look at singular entities. Yeah. And then, of course, also with the plural, you get different interactions with contractions of the prepositions, which are, like at least in Yiddish, you do not have any contraction with the preposition in the plural. So also at the syntax side, there is a difference to what you find in the singular, where the singular masculine easily contracts, the plural masculine doesn't contract.
So the maximality is not about an entity, but about a set, then, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So you have, like, group entities, right? You have a maximal group entity. But it depends on your plural semantics, right? If your plural semantics work with group entities, then you have those maximal group entities. If your plural semantic works more in sets, then you would assume these sets. Yeah.
So I have a bunch of questions, and I'll just ask them, and then we can do.
I choose my favorite.
Choose your favorite. So you've been railing against the Yata operator, which I think is fair, but Coppock and Beaver, who you cited, actually come up with a very different thing where they're separating out existence from uniqueness, right? So why didn't you just use their approach?
Okay. What I really like about their approach is, again, that they also are one of those people who said, okay, we need to distinguish between those two things, but they have encoded the uniqueness as a presupposition, which is not what we want to have.
Okay.
That's basically the reason.
Okay. And then on slide 53, where you say syntactic selection accounts for difference between proper names and unique nominals, as far as I could see, that's basically a stipulation. You're just saying this is the way it is, and I have actually no explanation for it.
Yes, there is no explanation for it, because, like, look at German.
But shouldn't there be a semantic, pragmatic explanation for it if you build up more things, like in the line of what you've been doing or what Coppock and Beaver have been doing? That would be the hope, I would say.
Okay, now, like, coming from my own native speaker intuitions about German, where I speak a continuum of varieties where I can use definite articles with proper nouns or not, or like in German we have certain things that in, like, even if you're not a speaker of German who uses a proper name with a definite article, you still would say things like das Ei des Columbus and not das Ei Columbus, because you want to mark overtly that it's genitive case. So there are certain, there's just an interaction with, like, the case system of your language, or what is overtly marked and what isn't. So I do not really have hope for a principled account for that. I can see that so the account predicts that the proper names and the uniques, those are the cases where we expect to find no article if your formal language, if the syntax and the morphology of your language allows for that. That's sort of the principal thing that we do.
So that leads into the last question that I had, which is, you talked about articleless languages at the end, and those often do it with case marking, so like Turkish and Urdu. So there should be a more principled, like you're saying, account which takes into account what else is happening in the morphosyntax of the language and how that is being expressed.
Yeah, so the first half of Asif's paper actually looks at the various realizations of these. Like I said, it's different definite articles, but he actually looks at various also different morphological or syntactic or morphological realizations of articles, including case systems, or I don't know, you have like language that marked with like different possessives and so on. And so then it would be what I here put into the semantics of a word would then of course be put into the semantics of an affix, or of the morphological rule that creates the inflected form, whatever your morphological model looks like.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I have just one comment. You notice Rodney Huddleston had these series of examples from English where uniqueness doesn't strictly hold. Okay? I'll give you just one example. Dangerous piece of advice: rest your cup on the arm of your chair.
Yes.
Now, of course, most likely your chair has two arms.
Yeah.
But it's not significant in the current context which one you actually choose. So maybe there needs to be something added to the uniqueness.
Yeah. So that's like with the body parts, right? That's what I meant with the body parts, with like the two ears, and it's like the body parts of the chair, right? And so it's a similar thing that you have there. If just something comes in has these inherent parts where you have more of the same, then languages tend to refer to an object. And so that's sort of an additional problem that needs to be incorporated, and these are exactly the kind of things. Yeah, absolutely.
I might already have asked you this question, so I apologize if I did. So one thing that puzzles me is that it looks like the uniqueness requirement is blocked in preposition filters. So
sorry?
Is blocked in by preposition filters.
Okay.
So if you say something like, if John bought only one book, the book is about Warsaw. That seems all right, and that seems to then that seems to filter out the uniqueness requirement, right? In that context, you're not committing yourself to the fact that there's a unique book that John bought.
Okay, the nice thing about this approach, which is also basically what I think would also like Schwarz and Elborn do, is that the S0 is, the current situation is used as a free variable here. But of course, if you have something that binds the free variable, that binds your situation, if you're quantifying over situations, then it's sort of only, it's, you know what I mean? So then it's sort of, it doesn't project to the real situation. It projects to the, it's bound by this other situational quantifier. Right?
So this means that, so in practice, you're losing presupposition filters as a way, as an empirical way of assessing whether you're dealing with a presupposition or conventional interpreter.
I mean, for the anaphoric definites, there is this, we must just, because we can use the anaphoric definites in exactly those contexts. We have the covariation with quantifiers in the anaphoric definites, but not in the uniques, and that's why in the uniques, the uniqueness condition is, we quantify over the situation in the uniqueness condition, in the semantics of the uniques, but not in the semantics of the anaphoric definites. There, the uniqueness is really with respect to the current S0, which is a free variable there, but that can be bound, but not for the real uniques. Yeah, is that?
Yeah, I think we should stop here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thanks to the speaker again.